How are you feeling, sir?
Yeah, I feel completely normal, which is, of course, part of the weirdness of it all.
Yeah.
Just completely normal. The scary thing is the statistics for me now having a second and big one are very high.
Well, such is life, but I wouldn't dwell on it too much.
Well, I do have to probably go on medication and look at other factors because
Are they putting you on statins or something?
I don't know. I'm waiting to see the specialists this week.
Oh, well, fingers crossed.
Yeah, thank you. It's been very unpleasant. And especially later on, as I learn more about it, one of the things is this aphasia that I had could also be in writing. I wrote a note during this to myself, like a diary entry, and it reads like gibberish. I'm not sure if that's autocorrect and I didn't pay attention, but yeah, that's if I lose both voice and writing, that's not good. It may be good for all of those who listen to me, but
well, I mean, my family has long maintained my writing's gibberish anyway, so look on the bright side.
In the gibberish in the sense that the words are in the wrong order. So.
No. I sorry, I didn't mean to be flippant. I know I took your meaning as meant.
Yeah. So Fabienne is kind of here. Is Fabienne here?
Can't hear the treadmill.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, you will have seen, I sent to you and Fabienne, well, actually one or two in the sort of group here, some extra reference notes I made up Mark Bernstein's talk last week, which I think you were at. But so I sent it to Deanie because I thought I didn't see her there, and sure enough, she hadn't seen it. But I thought it was really good for the undergraduate course she has at the moment. Because I just came to reflect on the fact that a lot of this stuff is actually, it's not hidden, but it's hard to find. And I was saying, what is the point in making, most people wouldn't bother. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I have all this information. I shall jolly well put it out there and save others, the finding it.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And of course, it plays into our discussions of things visual matter, and this, this problem of stuff going away tight. Hello, Peter.
Hello. I still look like death warmed over, but I'm slowly recovering from that flu.
Well, I'd have to say the picture of Dorian Gray that we're seeing looks absolutely fine.
Indeed.
Hopefully by next week I'll be bopping around in front of my green screen with my old self.
Yes, well, wishes for a speedy recovery.
Oh, thanks so much for putting out that bibliography on Mark's talk. Deeply appreciated.
Cool. Well, it won't surprise you. I mean, in the context of the sort of things we've been talking about, I mean, I did. It was partly because I did something for the lecture I gave for Deanie's course, and I started out and I was I'm mentioning all these things, so I better reference them. And I suddenly realized I got up to about 100 references. I thought, that's just numbers on a screen. And the interesting thing was, how do you share it? Because if you put it in a print form, you get something that's not actionable. If you know what it is, oh yes, it's referring to such. If you don't know what it is, it means you've now got to waste time putting into the lottery that is a search machine and hoping it comes up 3 cherries first time round. Whereas the detail, such as I have it, is buried in my reference manager, but that's a database. And so the reason I sent a BibTeX thing out, or BibTeX RIS, pick your pick, none of them are perfect. But I figured that that's where the real stuff is, things like URL, because in this day and age, how are you going to dereference that info? You're going to stick something in your browser, either a search term or a URL, and start there. Which is another reflection on, how way behind the curve our citation systems are these days.
And it's so maddening when people reorganize their websites and they don't bother to tell the search engine for the website that it had a previous organization once. I have been hitting this so many times, it's enough to just, make me tear out my hair if I had hair.
Well, there's always the Internet Archive, which has, I must say, come up trumps me in a number of really obscure things recently.
But they'll rename whole sections of the website. There won't be any record to help you go from what the old organization was to what the new organization is. Or you get just the 404 error when you type, okay, well, let's see. Oh, there is one paper here that's still there. So maybe if I back up one level, I should be able to find everything else. No, of course not. That'll be the one dangling reference with the old structure on the file system. Everything else will have been wiped out.
Yep. And things wink out. So actually, one of the most challenging references in Mark's lecture was to something. So, oh, it's something Rosemary Simpson, who sadly passed just last year, sort of did, and I think it was published, but I'm not sure. And I found a reference. She referenced it in a paper of hers as something submitted, but clearly never published, which is as close as I got to it. But you know, then again, who cares about a Lisp system from 1986? Probably not lots of people, but you know, it's another brick in the wall.
I would.
I thought so, which is why I thought, oh, I'm not going to stop. You know, I'm not going to leave one thing unreferenced in this. I had to put something in there. Otherwise, you know, why bother?
Oh, thank heavens for honey and tea.
Well, coffee here.
How are you doing, Frode?
Yeah, I'm okay. A bit worried about the future, but yeah, no, it was a bit scary. Yeah, Friday was not the best, and today is not exactly brilliant either. Anyway, is Fabian here or not? I guess
Yes, he is.
Oh, you are here. Okay.
Hi.
Hello.
You've been released from the workhouse. You're not on your treadmill.
Well, I was going to set it up. If it doesn't bother people, if it doesn't somehow make you lose focus. Okay. If we're going down this road, I'm one of my goals for 2023 was to what I can't usually do or can't do so far. And one of them is I convinced myself I suck at anything like roller skating, skiing, anything about gliding. And I think that's just an excuse for me not to do it. And in order to help people around me who want or might want to do this, I thought, okay, I just got to do it. It doesn't matter if I repeat, if I tell people, oh, I'm just too stiff, I just can't flex my knees and whatnot. So for the last 5 or 7 days now, I just put the rollerblade on every day, half an hour. I'm still terrible at it, but first, I'm alive. And second, my mindset behind it is there are 2 tricks that really are working for me at least. One is I always do a little bit more in terms of reach. So for example, I start in front literally of my door, and then I just do the street, and then just the block, and then just the park. So every time it's like, wow, I can literally reach more. And there is always something fun, as in like a little bit of rain, a little bit of mud, little like slope going down. So every time there is a new challenge. So that like broader reach in terms of challenge and learning really works for me. And the other trick was helping somebody while doing it. Yeah. Because every time I try to do it, I'm like, oh, this slope is too hard. I can't go. And if there is somebody in front of me going there anyway, and I need to help, like shit, I need to. Of course, if there is like literally a truck going in front, then I don't want everybody to die. But otherwise, that's been. So a lot more sport, and means yes, I will have to go back on the treadmill, not with the rollerblades in the office, but everything that I can do to be a little bit, how do you say, stronger, healthier for my legs to reach that goal. I'm going to do it.
Well done.
Hi, Alan. So that's what it takes to get you back into the meetings, huh?
Very good. Yes, that's
Hi,
exactly
Raul.
what it takes. I demand a sacrifice.
Yeah. Yeah, I just read the statistics, and the sacrifice is, yeah, serious. Yeah, so I think most of you know, on Friday I had a stroke. And what happened was Thursday night, oh, big breakthroughs in work stuff. Oh, very good. A lot less stress. It's been a very stressful month, as you know, including having a friend die in my hallway, plus other layers you don't need to know about, but just visceral, physical. And today is both the birthday of my oldest friend who died a few years ago and Doug Engelbart. So today is also a little sad day. But anyway, Friday morning, wake up, go downstairs and write up the thing that I would really like to show you, if you don't mind, in a few minutes. And then what's happening to my computer here? Sorry, it's supposed to be rendering. Anyway, leave that. And then I go up to tell Emily that don't worry about the light in the kitchen. I turned it on this morning. It hasn't been on all night. And the words come out, but they come out in a completely random sequence, which is obviously not good. And in the beginning, she didn't take me seriously. And then she realized I wasn't just being a dick. Called the ambulance, and living here in the UK, the ambulance came within 5 minutes, which is shockingly good considering the state of the NHS and financing at the moment and strikes. And they were very professional, checked all kinds of things, took me to the ambulance, took me to the hospital, fantastic triage, a CT scan, chest x-ray, all kinds of things, because I also have a weird cough. And it's confirmed that it was a stroke. And aphasia is what I had, of course. And having done some basic reading up on it since then, it is actually possible that aphasia affects writing as well as speech, but that would have been the end. And also 1 in 8 people die on their first stroke. And now that I've had one, I have a 40% chance of having another one. So I have to take serious attention to aspirin and whatever other drugs, absolutely no stress, including, that's funny, Wendy Hall just sent me an email about this. Yeah, so anyway, that's my update. Bit of a refocusing thing. It's kind
I'm
of
glad you're with us right now, and I think one of the goals of this talk should be to not create any more stress, right?
You got it. What he says, everybody. It's just ridiculous. So it was very strange because at the time it happened, I felt like maybe I was drunk or something. I wasn't worried or had no fear or stress or anything. It was just saying words. That's not what I meant. Let me try again. Saying stuff. No, those aren't the words. And again, it was really actually fascinating. You know, I'm going through a phase of reading brain books, you know, how things do this and that. So obviously I know where this is in the brain. So when they finally told me it was a stroke, I knew, that's why afterwards I had a headache here because it connects to this. And, you know, Brandel, you know exactly what I mean. So that was, yeah. So sorry, I'm just looking for a page I would like to show you. So I've got my corrections from my PhD and it's ridiculous. Some of it, if I apply myself, can probably be done. Other things I don't think maybe can be done. And I've tried to get my advisors to confirm. And all they're saying is, oh, no, you had a stroke. You must rest. Anyway, there's 2 things. We have a few topics for today, but there's 2 things. The first topic is, you know, as you also know, I'm obsessed with photography, and I've been spending the last couple of weeks really delving into doing this and that video, and I could spend literally the entire day talking to you about the technical details. But then explaining to a friend after this stroke, when she was saying, I'm doing too many things, I explained the layers of what I do, and, you know, like photography and text are my outputs. And then I realized, and this is why I'm asking you and telling you, Andy Hertzfeld, HyperCard, when he left Apple, what did he do? He became a photographer. Jeff Rulofson, who was Doug Engelbart's main programmer, what did he do? And I don't know if it's official, but he takes a lot of really boring pictures in his retirement. And Doug Engelbart, what did he do when there was a beautiful sunset when he was in the military? He asked if he could leave the base just so he could enjoy the sunset. And the really fascinating thing is Mark Anderson, over the last few sessions, I've talked about how he thinks him and I think visually differently. And I don't have a foggiest idea what he means. And over time, I'd really like to find out. But my question to all of you, do you think that, you know, are we specifically interested in visual things? Us kind of peoples? Brandel vigorously.
I'm certainly a visual abstract thinker. If these types have any sort of validity at all, and it's fluid, and I'm sure there's all sorts of shifting endless frameworks, but I tend to be very visual and abstract. There's a great book on it.
Alan, you're not supposed to stress me. I don't want to buy another fucking book.
All right.
I probably have that one actually, but with a different color cover. Do you have it, Mark?
I don't. But one thing I would say is, I mean, I raised the subject with some sort of trepidation because it had sort of come out from some of the stuff I was doing at the Tinbox community, and it's one of those things where it just always seems that unintentionally ends up as a sort of zero-sum judgment, and everyone feels a bit got at. But what put me in mind of it was trying to help someone basically in using an open-ended tool, and I realized that I was dealing with someone who actually was very visual in their approach, but in a very different way to the way that I was seeing it. And I thought, okay, right, I'm doing this all wrong. Part of the problem was I was struggling to sort of create this different point of view that I didn't have in order that I could, try and speak from alongside their perspective. But I just thought it interesting. I don't see it as any way, I just see it as one more spectrum of our existence. I certainly don't see it as any way as a qualitative judgment. I just find it pertinent in the context of sometimes in terms of explaining things.
Sorry, please continue, Alan.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's interesting with Brandel's head shake, but we'll get to that.
There is yet another book, but it's one that I've been reading, and it's actually a surprising diversion for me. It's a really good book by Twyla Tharp called Creative Habit, and I bring it up because it's as much an exercise book as it is deeply wise. Twyla Tharp is a famous choreographer. So her world is ballet, and it seems like there would be very little overlap. The first book in the title, the first book I mentioned is Creative Thinkers by Temple Grandin. So this book has been to a general audience by a choreographer would not be the first on my list, but it is really insightful and brilliant. One of the things that she mentions in here, totally apart from the visual thinking, the different types, but I think it applies, is that, she mentions that she thinks that everybody has a creative DNA, that there are just things that are imprinted on us as similarly as being left-handed or right-handed. And one type of creative DNA that she has is, or believes in, that everyone has, is observational focal length. So some people are right up in it, and she gives an example of Philip Marlowe and the great film noir novels that the plot's incomprehensible, but the details are very vivid. To one of her co-workers, who's a choreographer who did the dance sequences for West Side Story, he was arm's distance, like seeing the world, seeing the story of the world play out, like between characters. She phrases it much more eloquently. And then she is a she's a second. But then Mahler, a lot of composers and some of these directors are third person, in that they see the world as a cycle, as a dance, as a distance, and not a particular story, right? And that we intuitively, instinctively, inborn, may have these kinds of distances, and that there are a few perhaps super artists that can change the focal distance, and she considers Shakespeare to be an example of that. It's a lens, and it also, I think applies to photography. So just trying to tie it all together there.
That's really interesting. If you don't mind, because you have to be nice to me today. Can I show you my breakthrough?
Please.
All right, thank you. It is very indulgent, but who better than with you guys? Okay. Sorry, the control is a bit weird here. Right, so having spent years and years and years, remembering, 10 years ago, sitting at a Starbucks outdoor in Singapore at 4 o'clock in the morning working on this, I've been trying to help visual thinking like this. This is all I mean by visual thinking in this context. It's not, beyond this. And every time I've been working on it, it gets more complicated. And then it goes into all kinds of things and it becomes a bit ridiculous. And I just have to start again because it becomes very specific to a specific use case. And then, as you know, I have this plus this. Now, what the fuck is going on here, right? The fact that these lines go all over the place was, for weeks, a really big issue for me. And I decided finally last week, okay, the map in Author, I will put it away and call it an experimental feature. I literally cannot afford to do any more tweaking and that kind of stuff. And what happened on Thursday, and this was a bit before Mark Bernstein's presentation and during, is that I realized that there are two different things going on in here. And I don't need to change a thing, I think, but I do need to explain this to the audience, to the user. So let me show you what I think is going on and how I explained it and see if it jives with you guys. Number one, this is a kind of spatial hypertext, to use the fancy jargon, or you could call it a murder wall. Literally, containers is here. I could have had that heading here. It's arbitrary that it's a heading. Really doesn't matter. This is designed for one brain and it's mine, which thankfully is still functioning. And then I have metadata out here with nothing else. This is purely to help me get to grips with these things. So when these lines come up, they are dealing with something entirely different. And that's really, really important because I thought I would be able to get the lines going from here to there to be like a flowchart diagram, but that's just not the reality of the world, right? If you look at paratext, to take one, of course, includes index and includes endnotes, but it also includes other stuff and other references. A colophon thing, I have it under general metadata. All of this is up for discussion. I'm sure that specifically Peter and Mark disagree with a lot of this. I'm only halfway through, but the point is, this shows a kind of organization. This shows a kind of relationship. So therefore, on the website now, under integrated concept map, I make it really, really clear. You do Command E to define, you go to the map, and then you have two ways to work. One is to organize. And the language might be wrong. If you have a better language, I would love to hear it. And another one is connection. And I keep repeating or saying different ways. The connection lines do not usually follow the organization layout. It is something else. And then finally, talking about the importance of edit, a little bit of video. And on the automatic glossary, one of the things I'm trying to present this as now is to help teachers rate students' work. Because if you see the connective scaffolding, as a very pretentious, intelligent friend called it, it's much easier for them to judge whether it's been written by AI or by them, because they have shown literally how things connect, which is another issue. But yeah, what do you think? Does it make sense that these are two different things, or is it all mushed together?
It needs to be two different things, and dive into that more, because the thing you're bucking against is the impoverished affordances of lines and arrows, right? Like, that's an unnecessary constraint, and so it's great that you're finding a good, strong separation of concerns. then the next exploration would be to like how to visually distinguish, like even if it were type 1 has a circle around the subject and it points to a thing, and type 2 points directly to the thing, some way to easily distinguish two. But yeah, I love how you're thinking there.
I kind of have that. So people are italic because they've been tagged as person. So I'm looking at slight ways to make certain things. And if you look down here, organizations, they are bold italic because they're people and they're big. So that's slowly
Right.
happening.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be too complicated, but I agree with that approach. Mark?
It was very interesting you share this, because in a sense I've been through a similar epiphany just in the last couple of weeks, coming from a slightly different place, but I think it speaks to the same thing, and it's the problem that these sort of map views, for want of a better term, where you basically got an endless canvas, so you can move stuff around in it. We unintentionally push together two sorts of activity. One is the sort of loosest associative thinking. It's basically just putting stuff out there, and it could be Post-its on a wall, it could be loose sheets of paper on the floor. It's just a digital forms for that very, very loose sort of thinking. And then there's what I think of almost what becomes a much more hard-edged, almost drawing mode, where someone says, right, I now want it to look like a diagram. And a further complication is that's what a lot of things do. So if you take something like Obsidian and look at its chart, an algorithm will lay out all the things as a force-directed graph, which doesn't actually tell you anything except that it's a force-directed graph, if I can be cynical for a moment. And it's not to be unkind to the thought behind that, but I think what this gets at is that, and it comes, so in a Tinderbox document, sorry, keep going back to this, but it's the thinking too.
No, that makes complete sense.
The underlying, when you make a document, the underlying storage is an outline. When you draw a map, a map only ever shows you one container within the outline. And people say, no, but I don't want to do that. I want to make this wonderful diagram. Then I want to linearize it because I'm going to write a report. So I need to nest things in the outline. Why can't I flatten the map? And it's a very persistent thought. And no matter how many times the people, you explain that it's actually not quite as simple as that, because, things get in the way. And what you're imagining in your mind, wouldn't happen as fluidly. And you probably would end up back at the sort of force-directed graph or some other algorithmic layout.
I'm just writing down what you're saying.
Which sort of, I'm beginning to see people don't like, and that's what they sort of graduate on from. So I thought this was really cool until I tried to use it, and I realized it wasn't telling me anything. It was merely telling me what I'd done. If I make a link, something has a line to it on the chart, but what does that, what was the intentionality? Where's the serendipity I was hoping for? So there's a really interesting challenge in how whether you can do the mode shift, I don't know. And I'm not enough of a sort of, I don't have the background in sort of graphic design and all sorts of areas to know if it's possible. But what I sense people are looking for is to be able to shift almost seamlessly from this associative thinking space where things are where they need to be and they're associated as much as they need to be, which can be very fluid and is something our minds generally are quite happy with, to something that effectively is backing into linearization, which is a requirement for many of our communications and sort of storage forms. And it's that transition is where it all begins to go to. And if I understood correctly, I think that's the same thing you were pulling on the edge of.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think what comes out of it, by the way, I put in the link if anybody wants to have a look, and added a sentence, thank you, Mark, saying this is for thinking, not making diagrams, blah, blah, blah. That's really important to help people understand. I'm still really eager to go more and more into VR, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Brandel has to say, but I didn't want to go in there with, oh, it's big, that'll be the solution. I think the solution is to have flexibility to change views. There's a lot you can do on a laptop. And when you use the big space, we should be yet another kind of diagram. And to think a different kind of diagram is quite hard because we're used to what diagrams are. So yeah, Mark, thank you very much. Brandel.
I think it's really interesting for you to be sort of discovering and peeling apart these different and distinct functions. I think it plays to that, one of those things that we've sort of talked about here in the past about whether writing serves to try to create a static built artifact that people will consume in a really specific way, or whether you're building a tool for this sort of progressive discovery that can come from sort of the dynamic manipulation that is able to flow from having a digital document that is expected to remain digital. Because creating a diagram is obviously an activity in that former camp, and even if people discover some functionality that's more like the latter within it, then most of the time those two things are incidental in terms of the way they relate to each other. And unfortunately, if you build a diagram that's worth building of the former, they can become really, really difficult to follow and parse, because as you can kind of pretty easily establish in that thing, you just throw a couple of terms up, and then the crisscrossing lines become pretty quickly too difficult to be able to see. And you're right that one thing that I would say about that is that VR helps, but another sort of again, like maybe incidental consequence of sort of thinking about it as being solved by VR is that nobody's yet been able to print a VR document, so that there's not been any real consideration of a static analog to what people explore within the context of virtual reality. It always remains in this intrinsically dynamic, digital, and as it happens, three-dimensionally spatial environment. But it, like you say as well, that it need not be so. As long as you concede the point that this is something that's to be continuously consumed and manipulated in a context where the ability remains fresh and ready to hand, to be able to kind of toggle these views, then it remains a different kind of object, a different kind of document, and one that we still have very little experience with. So I'm really excited about the sense in which the map is something to be explored and played with selectively in this way. And as you rightly put, I would say that that's cool in VR too, but yeah, like that reflexive kind of manipulation is front and center of what I think is missing from computing, frankly. The idea that you can create interactively deliberative tools rather than focus more sort of singularly on the production of a single finished and potentially static artifact. So yeah, I think that's everything.
Yeah, and there's so much there, Randall. If we manage to get one space of this, we manage to have some way to work it. We could use the phrase logic. It's not really the right phrase. You know what I mean? Then I can imagine much easier in a VR environment, having one document, you have a relatively small map, but all your other stuff can deal with it. You can take away the people in that document, put them back, but there's all these other things, like Peter talks quite often about a library. If the metadata is there, all of this can relate to everything else. But if everything can relate to everything else in a quote unquote dumb way, or even worse, as Mark said, force-directed graphs only, of course that can be useful. But if that's the only thing, then your knowledge is shaping itself. That is not the whole story. It needs to go through this thing for as long as we have it, right? Yeah, Mark, of course.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you probably guessed the impetus to my asking at Mark Bernstein's talk last week about VR. Because I was interested. His reply, which didn't surprise me, came back that, well, maybe not sort of 3D as some people think of VR, but 2.5D. More, in other words, more than just 2 dimensions. So the ability to tease things. Sometimes 2 dimensions aren't quite enough to have the granularity you want, but are perhaps assumptions sometimes that, in a sense, a full extra dimension, just having a z-axis is suddenly going to make things sort of 50% better or something, is perhaps us overreaching. Yeah.
I don't think that's what it is, and I'm going to pretend Randall isn't here. I think that VR will mostly be for work, mostly be at a desk. It'll mostly be static. I agree with the whole walking around and all that stuff. I think room scale VR will be amazing and all of that. But 2.5D, I don't think we're disagreeing here, Mark, you and me, but just in the sense that just having stereo vision over something, you get a little bit more of a sense of the space, but also like Randall talked about quite literally a year ago, those examples of data sets that are much, much bigger, they look like they're much smaller. It's not just because you can go around and do all these things, although that's hugely important. It is that our perceptive system really uses that data, even though it may be not there. I mean, to belabor a point, me and my obsession with imagery, one thing I've noticed with film very often, you can see it actually, ironically, if you look at Mark right now, if you look at Mark's forehead, you see the highlight, right? Completely blown out. No, that's, right there. And half of Alan's head and a little bit of Brandel, right? To me, if I watch TV, that's absolutely horrendous. It takes me out of the scene. It means that they haven't exposed properly, the curves aren't right, they probably didn't use log, right? Not interesting for most people in the world. But it does take you out of the thing a little bit. So even though you're watching a 4K movie at home or wherever, you may not notice, like right now, Alan has a really nice shirt on. And I know for a fact that it's a woven shirt just because it has to be. But the way we're looking at it now, we cannot see the threads. So if we're watching Alan in 4K, we would see the threads. So our perception of his presence would be very, very different. I think that goes very much into how we see data as well as in multiple dimensions.
Yeah.
I mean, have you ever walked down the street and seen a tree or a bush and said, damn, that's well rendered, right? Has that happened to you?
It's such a real thing. That topic alone is a whole different topic, but I feel like that falls into the inmates running the asylum or the exhaust of technology that hasn't been truly well considered. An example of that would be how there are some directors, Christopher Nolan comes to mind, who design their sound for the theater only. And therefore, if you watch a Christopher Nolan film at home, you will have to use the subtitles if you want to follow the dialogue. It's a similar sort of thing. It throws people out, and the fact that that's it's same with aspect ratio or frame rate, I believe, in decades of television or the plasma TVs would make every even 70s movie look like it was shot indoors or something, which boggles my mind.
Yeah, the sound.
Anyway,
I'm not a sound guy, but I hear what you're saying, and I think that's the perception of what something is changes.
We've never really had to deal with too much technology, too much precision, and it's funny that it's coming to the forefront now. Maybe it's a good thing because we have such high fidelity systems of economics. We have such fierce capitalism that it seems like the value in life is to attain more and to get more precise, and so it's natural to see that in our media.
Yeah, absolutely.
But,
and the perceptions are really, really interesting. A lot of people talk about filmic has to be 24 frames a second. What's happening on my other machine over here right now, I'm rendering a 30 frames a second, well, 2997 frame into 60 frames a second, because the work that I'm trying to do, I don't want it to be blurry people. I want it to be like they're there. But just doubling the frame rate does such a thing. And I really think, it's nice on a high-res screen, but in virtual reality, right now we're in cartoon land. We're almost back into Lawnmower Man. We have primary colors, simple things, and that is the stage we're at right now. But one of the great things in what's his face, forget it, the graphic designer guy, I'll think of it in a second. Yeah, one of the suggestions is if you want to have a nice color palette, take a picture of something in nature and just take the colors from there and you got it. There are things we relate to in different ways than other things. All these hands. Okay, Alan, over to you.
I just wanted to, I don't exactly remember where this applies, so maybe this is a totally different direction, but this is the book that I'm referring to, Paul Klee, Pedagogical Sketches. And he says something in here, and I'm not even sure that I'm interpreting it the right way, but it's been sticking in my head. The way that I paraphrase it is that when a line ceases to move, it ceases to be a line and it becomes a plane. Now, that's not specifically how he phrases it. In the process of being created, these figures have linear character, but once completed, this linearity is replaced by planarity. And he's speaking of these shapes in particular, right? So I mention that because what's beautiful about that in regards to the formal associations with diagrams and diagram making versus the informal associations of whiteboarding, right? Like, let's work together. There is an aspect of the active line. The line is conveying information as it's moving, but in the nature of these conversations and just the tools for thinking and representation, the line has already been made. And so it would be interesting if once the line has been made, if it kind of becomes a different thing. I don't have any answers for that. I just thought I'd share it.
Thank you. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, on my screen, Mark is next. Yeah.
I just partly I just want to say no. I absolutely agree with you. In sort of talking about the 2.5D thing, I absolutely wasn't sort of trying to make a point about VR. In a sense, I totally agree with you that viewing something in that medium makes it more than, you know, just 2D in a bit. The interesting point was particularly in relation to sort of tools for thought and thinking, the things we're on about, that as distinct from being in a VR environment was the fact of whether essentially having extra dimensions move the needle or not. And I think we're sort of actually broadly sort of in agreement. Yeah, because I'm not trying to put a hard box around it. It's just a sense of, so the interesting thing is actually having more freedom. The element of sort of realism or closeness that you mentioned, I think those are all extremely relevant. And I just have to say it because it's rattling around my brain. When you said, "Damn, you look well rendered," that sounds like a sort of Gen Z chat up line. And I'm about to put in the chat just something in case it's of use to others. I finally sort of realized that I slightly misunderstood the whole thing about the term of view specs, because there's a bit I finally found in Doug Engelbart's sort of archive, and essentially, so if we step back to NLS, you had, you know, your PDP console and a screen that probably cost as much as small affordable housing at the time, and, you know, not much on it. And what the view specs did was it changed what you saw in real time. So it's akin to the idea of having an application that has sort of multiple views. And the only difference really between that and NLS, as far as I can see, was in NLS, you literally would type in the necessary keystrokes and it would manipulate the view in real time, because in a sense there was one view and you were changing that. In something like a tool like Tinbox, which I'm used to working with, that basically has a number of predefined views, which are further definable by attribute, you know, value changes, which in a sense to view specs. So that's where I draw the line. And I don't think the tool that I mentioned necessarily deliberately drew on view specs. I was talking to Mark Bernstein. I think it was just an idea that was around at the time that, you know, basically got left in the weeds by most people. But I still think is interesting, again, in the context of tools for thought, because again, when we're talking about this mode shift, well, one way we perhaps may play with the representation that's in front of us is, in effect, having a dynamically malleable aspect to the view that we tweak according to what we need from it. Now, it's quite an advanced concept, but if you go with Doug Engelbart's ABCs, we're not necessarily talking about, you know, the person sat doing a quotidian job at a desk. It's more that maybe the same people, but when they're in a you know, a more reflective and a deeper thinking mode.
Thanks, Mark. Randall.
So I have had, it wasn't just a pickup line, I have had that experience of saying this is very well rendered. It was when my wife and I moved back to New Zealand from China, and the quality of the air and the quality of the colors of the natural world after we had been in a particularly polluted part of the Taklamakan Desert meant that there was a color contrast that had hitherto been completely inaccessible to us for the past year. I'd bought a digital camera, my first and only DSLR, just before we left New Zealand for China. And so I had used it over the period of the year. I had, without necessarily reflecting on it, the impression that perhaps the CCD had become dull, or that there was a buildup of something giving it rise to this lower and lower contrast as I was taking pictures of this environment. But then when I got back home, and it was only really because I was there for a whole year, more or less uninterrupted, that I was able to see these just dazzling blacks and whites. Just that the lights and darks were so shockingly high contrast, and all of that detail was sort of visible in fractal dimensions in the foliage. A few like 50 meters in front of me, it was pretty staggering. I wanted to talk about. Did you want to jump in there, Frodo, or you want? Can I tell you the thing that was?
No, go on. But on that, I just want to
radical.
know the idea of VR HDR.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that Meta has had some really interesting and exceptionally expensive proofs of concept for, where they, we have monitors that go up to 1,000 nits, and they've built, is it 10,000 or is it 100,000 nits? I'm not sure, but the sort of thing that might even be damaging to see under the wrong circumstances. But they've nevertheless had reason to do it, and I absolutely sympathize. I think it's really important to be able to go like, what would more contrast do as well as more dimensionality? Anyway, so what I wanted to talk about was detail and aesthetics and the poverty of the present moment within our context of the presentation of data. When you live in that natural world, when you see a forest or a tree or a blade of grass, there are arbitrary levels of detail that you can reach into for whatever reason you want, so you can understand and sort of perceptually conceive of, perceptually apprehend and consequently process cognitively a blade of grass as being a very simple object, organism, whatever you want. But it also goes all the way up, all the way in terms of the concepts that you can kind of associate with it. And there are all of these, there's this richness that persists, kind of whether you're thinking about it or not, whether people are being careful about it or not. I find the level of information that's in a lot of the built environment, but especially the built environment, to be like a particular kind of poverty, in that nobody's even thought that more could go into something. And so when you have a TXT file, that's all there is. There's no closer reading of that in a literal sense, and nothing about scrutinizing the shape of the pixels tells you much more about how the pixels got the way they are, how the bytes got the way they are. That's never the case in the real world. You can always pick apart through some fairly arcane methods, even say writing, understanding variations in the pressure of the pen against the surface, changes in the cant, maybe even capturing levels of carbon dioxide that might have been in the room as a consequence of somebody being stuck in there, and the atoms of the molecules of CO2 being embedded in the paper over the period of time. I don't know, but that's the stuff that things like CSI and various forensic investigations are made out of. And there are some people who know enough about computing and the sort of the black magic that might be required to pick apart aspects of how it is that somebody does something. But what I do know is that for the most part, that's out of the realm of people's attention and awareness as being even conceivable, let alone attractive as a capacity for us to be able to understand and process information. And yeah, I think that there are obvious ways that can happen, but there are also oblique ways. You know, the sort of practice of aesthetics is one in sort of recapitulating our sensibilities that will come from living in the variety of built or natural environments. You know, our aesthetics that prefer symmetry and rotational symmetry and sort of parallel constructions and stuff like that. They don't come from nowhere. They might at some level be understood to be natural for the human mind, but it's to do with being able to kind of transplant these series of expectations that we have about one sort of environ into another, and being able to kind of create satisfying patterns. I just think that there's so little of that within a digital context, so little of people's awareness of what it is that we're doing, that we don't have enough of a sense of how much more we can get out of it, and how much more richly we might be able to create and to read. It sort of reminds me of the hubris of whoever's statement was, you know, all that remains is to fill in the fifth decimal place, in the context of science at the turn of the 20th century. And yeah, what we're doing with computing and with the concept of information that we reach through computing is similarly impoverished at this present moment, and yet we sort of find ourselves declaring this horrendously premature victory as a consequence of most people's immaturity of reading of the possibilities. I hope that sounded relevant.
That was a nice ending phrase. Most people's immature reading of the possibilities. I just wanted to mention not on this topic, but before we move on, because I think we need to dwell on that more. I did send a letter to Apple's VR head. I'm not sure how much you know about that, Randall, but you were not informed beforehand. So I wrote a letter saying, author VR, a couple of pages, had it edited many times, well, properly written. Vince Cerf wrote a cover letter to Bruce Horn, who then sent it to his manager. And that's how it makes its way up, because obviously they can't even tell us who is in charge of VR at Apple, which is fine. But it got stuck in the weeds a little bit. So that's good news for me, because I've now done this representation of some of the aspects of author. So hopefully if someone does actually read it, they'll get a better impression of what I'm trying to put into VR. So all I'm asking for is early access to hardware and SDKs and all that good stuff. But I put the link in the chat. If you guys do want to have a look at the page, I'm going to get some basic spell checking, of course, for someone editing, whatever. But if you have any thoughts, whenever, of course, that's gratefully appreciated. But yeah, that is what I was trying to say.
Randall, if you could make sure I don't have early access, that would be great, because otherwise my boss won't let me leave the office.
That's what I should have done. That's so much more direct than Claire.
You're not part of the W3C immersive web, are you, Fabian?
Nope.
Do you have a mechanism to be a member?
I am a member.
You're not part of an organization.
I am.
Individually, I could. From the parliament, that would be problematic. It's I suggested like 4 years ago or so.
I'm a member because I'm part of Waze still, because my PhD is drawing out forever, and Waze is I think the European headquarter or whatever. What are we, Mark? Something like that.
Yes, we're the what do they used to call it in RP? We're the local node. I think we're the European node for W3C.
But we've got Tim Berners-Lee.
Yes, Wendy was
So
involved.
special. We're special. We've got Tim.
That's right.
Well, so to be a member of specifically, to be a member specifically of the immersive web, sort of steering committees, either the working group or the community group, it's specifically the entity that's responsible for WebXR and what Apple, we are pushing the concept of the HTML model element through. I believe that we are looking at having a face-to-face meeting at some point. And I think Ada is trying to get it so that we host it. So that'll be interesting. In the context of all of this, Meta and all of the other entities who are responsible for sort of progressing the specification are still pursuing a very particular agenda in terms of thinking what WebXR is for. To the extent that people want to, it is a technical committee, but it is one that would be really, very helpfully informed to the extent that people have the patience for the bike shedding by some of these more intrinsically informational concerns. Something that I try to bring to my deliberations of it, but it's a neat venue.
Alan was asking
in terms of membership. Yeah, I believe
It seems like it would be
join.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think anybody who can join the community group. I'm not sure if everybody is allowed to join the working group. So the first thing is, I think by definition, anybody in good standing for whatever value good standing is, should be able to join the W3C per se. But then, the majority of the sort of the working group stuff is done by the people who actually have, because it's the World Wide Web Consortium, then the people who build browsers have a lot to do with that. But other academic institutions and people who have a point of view on the concept of data also come in as invited experts frequently as well. So there are a range of ways in which people can kind of intervene on those deliberations. But yeah, Immersive Web is the committee that does, like I said, that, and really interesting in terms of what it is that people steer toward with reference to the technologies and what they have ready to hand. So obviously Meta has the best publicly available headset out there right now, and so they're like, let's see if we can find a way to fit all of the capabilities that we've built for this device. So Rhoda, you're aware that it has facial expression tracking and other things like that. Like, is there a way for us to integrate that into a web experience? Like, why? What is it? What does that do? And how is that meaningful specifically on the web in contrast to where else it is and stuff like that? So yeah, really interesting questions and a really interesting place, because it actually has the capacity to impact the specifications that fall out of it.
Just a quick little explosion of separate ideas. Familiar with W3 just because how long it's taken to do anything in CSS is almost laughable, right? Hopefully the immersive web has a quicker turnaround time about things, but it's all these. It's funny because it seems to be like an impossible position of how to get it just right. Flexbox comes out, it's wrong about X, Y, and Z. Then Grid comes out and it's better, but now there's two platforms and it's confusing which one to use. Anyway, that got me thinking about just like there's so much documentation there. After the talk, the Tools for Thought Rocks talk, I dug into ACM for the first time in a while, and I got to thinking about what we were working on 2 years ago, or what Future Text was working on 2 years ago, which is the ACM, discovery portal, and how useful that would be. And I wonder if with something like not even Chat GPT, but just GPT-3, if it could really open the doors of summarization and collaboration between all the documents, because there is so much there, and findability is impossible. Even though that doesn't seem like a VR problem, it could still be a VR problem, right? Because findability is still just as much a problem in 3 dimensions as 2. Like even with soft space, I believe they would still, even though it's a beautiful graph experience, there would still be a problem of which is the thing that I want to find, you know? So that's all.
I had
Sorry.
a really interesting and unexpected experience with ChatGPT in recent days. Somebody in the Tinderbox community who knows how to do this wrote and posted a series of prompts. He thought, I wonder if it can help me learn about this thing. I thought, now this is interesting because there's very little. This is a very small community. It's a small tool. There's very little written about it. And in fact, probably I've written more about it than the vendor has. So I thought this will be interesting. And I can put a link if you want. I mean, it doesn't really help because the point being that I knew the subject area really well. And so it started off with how do I do general stuff, and it all made sense. You could have picked it out of any PKM stuff, but we got by the time it was how did you do something sort of actionable, I could see the cracks appearing, and I was beginning to see stuff that I'm guessing had come from Adobe Creative Suite documentation creeping in. But the really interesting observation, because he kindly posted this and people were saying, you know, they read it and what they thought was, we were all saying, the weird part was how we'd look at something and then try and actually carry out those instructions, which we knew to be wrong because they seemed so right. And it was really interesting because I've sort of seen stuff done, and I've enjoyed sort of seeing how well it seems to capture a moment. But it's the first time I'd seen that technology using something that I knew well enough in detail to see, okay, this is actually genuinely scary. And the other reflection I did find myself having with is that although everything I write, I give back to the community for free because I choose to, part of me still think, wait a minute, hey, where's the attribution? Thank you very much. And yeah, that's another interesting thing because it doesn't know where it's come from. And indeed, if you're on top of a dynamic LLM, the answer you get tomorrow is not the answer you get today, and may even come from a different source.
Right.
Which is something, and it doesn't matter, unless I sound like I'm a sort of naysayer on this, absolutely not. I'm in awe of what's been done. It's just some interesting new challenges come along for the ride, as ever, with something new.
I'll just throw in there. Yeah, it's very much like Randall's comment about from science is all figured out except for the decimal points. Last five or five deep. That's, I mean, the last mile problems that are coming out of GPT, ChatGPT. That's going to be the fun stuff, right? Like, what are the situations where it really excels, and what are the things that you might as well just throw yourself off a cliff, right? And so getting the nuance of the scope, right? Like, and I think actually there's more transparency in the generative art side than in the GPT side, right? Because you can see how closely it resembles what you're after. So I'm actually pretty excited on the generative art side, like change this to this, right? I can't remember the latest one that came out, but it's like where you can get more specific about the changes that you want to see. And I'm hoping that there'll be a trend of like whatever starts to happen in the generative art sort of trickles into the transformers that are powering, GPT, and anyway, the point is that, yeah, like for the ACM, if it were to use GPT, it would be in a pretty scoped way, right? So that it's not just like, tell me what this article is about, but more like what, just for the purpose of finding things inside an incredibly deep corpus, it would be really interesting to see what GPT could do outside of summarization.
I suppose part of the issue is this thing of finding the two questions we tend to want to ask: show me more things like this without defining what like means, and show me the thing I had in my hand yesterday without really defining what it was you had in your hand, which ends up being like standing behind the decorator and telling them to repaint the room until it's the right color without telling them. We didn't do it intentionally, but they're really quite difficult. Like, I don't think that argues it at all against what you're saying. I think the challenge becomes, okay, how do we surface what right is? Because the lesson I took away from the analysis done on that was it's amazing how bad we are at keywording, even keywording our own stuff. In fairness, I'm sure a lot of people actually at the time, even maybe now, don't actually think when they fill in the box that says keywords, please, that that's what they're doing.
Yeah, but I mean, one
few
thing
they tend to do is throw tons of keywords in.
I understand your criticism or concern on reticence of the power of GPT and so on, Mark, how it's not thoughtful and so on. And I agree with you when it comes to text. However, when it comes to images, it's spectacular. It just is. You know, it can't tell you why it chose to make something in that particular way and why it chose to have a line here, not there, but it's still absolutely spectacular. And GPT-4 is, you know, orders of magnitude bigger. So, you know, we're just going to have to accept writing.
Yeah, and it's interesting.
It is going to be a large part of writing in the same way that today we don't judge people for using autocorrect and things like that. It's just going to be, and that has to be the starting position, and we just have to figure out how to integrate that into actual thoughts.
Yes, we're talking with a lab group this morning. I mean, it's interesting. One thing somebody said, well, surely this will, you know, put illustrators out of a job. We thought, well, no, not really, because the thing I found really awesome with the art side of the sort of GPT thing is, yeah, it would just make these amazing confections, which for someone like myself who can't paint for toffee is actually, you know, really wonderful. Whether it can iterate that, whether it can say, okay, I want that in a series of poses or something, and actually do it with a fidelity that an illustrator would. In other words, knowing what aspect of the thing it's produced.
But Mark, these are very specific and different things. I mean, the link that
no, I know they are. I'm just
hang on. Let me just say what I mean. The link that Fabian put up, the one to Timothy Brooks, it does actually show the drawings being iterated through additional prompts. But of course, for very specific things, if you need it done in a specific way. But don't forget also, when it comes to even photography, which is basically capturing the world, you do need, I'm sorry, there's a lot of stuff you can't really decide beforehand. You know, the reality will make it so. So there's going to be a huge range, and, you know, we're going to see a lot of crap images that are just slightly off. And of course we'll hate it, but, you know, desktop publishing revolution in the 80s, what happened? Everybody used 20,000 fonts in a document. It was awful. But it was the new thing. At some point, it's going to settle. But yeah,
sure, I think that's what I was saying. I'm not quite sure what the difference was, but yeah, you know, absolutely, and it will get better.
Fair enough. Of course. Yeah, Brendel.
Yeah, on the subject of what it is that art directors do, my brother is one such art director, and over the years of seeing his work and what it's made out of, it's incredibly synthetic. What it is he does is bring together and just infinitely iterate on layers and layers and layers of information, making tweaks and modifications at all numbers of granularity at every stage of the way in order to negotiate with one ingrained sense of aesthetics, but also a number of really sort of heavy-handed narrative or ludic or whatever sort of constraints that apply in the context of whatever it happens to be. So, you know, when you're doing art direction for TV commercials or things, then there are brand guidelines that go down to palette and the kinds of visual features that should be sort of legible in terms of, you know, the mix of horizontal versus vertical lines. Like these are, they're so particular, and some people have the ability to give voice to them, and some people do not, while still being able to kind of pay attention to them and apply them. So the level of sophistication of what it is that somebody who is sort of specifically commercially involved in the concept of producing visual art is one that, I'm not worried about, one, because it's so hard, but two, because the capacity to build a couple of layers or to build some stuff that can then be separated out into bits and pieces for the purposes of being able to hack and modify, is going to be really welcome for them. You know, being able to kind of just, rather than having to go out and do the 200th shoot for rusty metal gratings for the week, they'll be able to simply conjure those things up. We already sort of discovered the problems that are attended from that, from people sort of changing from simply looking in their own environment to using the first couple pages of Google image searches. And so there's a sameness to people's renderings of various things. You know, famously, George Bush's paintings of world leaders tend to be all from the first page of Google image searches, and the more you know that particular trick, the harder it is to unsee. So yeah, I think that to your point as well, Frode, about the sort of eventual settling into a lower energy of desktop publishing, the sort of annealing process of people calming down and figuring out what it's really for. That's going to happen with all of the mid journeys and where I have less hope though is actually ChatGPT, because we're coming to it from so much poorer a position of understanding what it is that goes into writing. We don't have the concept of these intermediary artifacts in such a way as to be able to submit them to examiners and other people, except for perhaps something at a PhD level, but it's anathema in the context of a simple essay for there to be any kind of scaffolding or working, which would nevertheless be able to kind of show the function and the process by which a writer actually wrote something, in contrast to simply sort of retrieving it from ChatGPT. So I think that that's a really great and promising idea for the way that we can pursue an integrated approach of being able to accept that ChatGPT and other things are here to stay. But I think that there's an enormous amount of deliberative work for us to be able to kind of imagine, let alone formalize, some of the structures that people might make use of in order to be able to demonstrate that this is my thought. I came up with this, and yeah, I should get the grade instead of ChatGPT.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, I'm not particularly super interested in AI writing and reading, except for when we can make it interactive, just like we talked about. News specs are most powerful when you can change them. So, once we can do, I mean, like Apple's new text-to-speech for books is insanely good, right? So right now it's only being used for romance novels or something. It's very specific what it's tuned to. It's not going to be that far in the future with its, Siri's voice. All of them are going to sound like an actual person next to you. We're probably going to have to apply voice filters like we have Instagram filters, so we know that it's not necessarily a person if we want to. That's going to be hugely, amazingly interesting too. But in terms of the future and text, it's got to be focused on the interactivity, right?
A quick thought on that. I agree with all of that.
That's a
I
lot
do
to
think
agree
what's
with.
happening. Yeah. I think an interesting maybe framework or thought experiment for this, for just the broad swath of what's going on, is that the idea of what is reading and what is writing and what is communicating with others versus ourselves is a domain that's just exploding, right? Yeah. And so I take, for instance, that what I get the most value out of ChatGPT is to talk to myself, to be able to see a question in a third person that still feels like me, that I can then just seeing someone else say the very same thing that I said in a slightly different way, it changes my lens pretty powerfully. And I'm wondering, it makes me wonder the degree of misfit that goes on when a human talks into the Twitter megaphone, not realizing the engagement that they have, the contract that they're signing, right? And then creating all sorts of unintended problems, right? If AI could step in and help in those kinds of situations, right? And that's a very instructive one, but I don't necessarily mean it instructively. I mean, being able to see what you're saying in a third person perspective, and then take a moment to realize, oh, this isn't just talking to myself. This isn't just talking to my friend. This is talking to, in this case, the entire world. For that, and even for like our own knowledge management, it could be useful to encode things because it's a different language when we talk to ourselves versus when we talk with the intention of publishing or pushing to production or something. And I just mentioned that because that's some of the things I've been thinking about lately is the formality of our systems and how the tools are designed with formality in mind, because they come from they are evolutionary byproducts of like architectural diagrams or formal tools. And the way that we're using them now a lot of these tools are very informal and very lazy, very stochastic. And it's amazing that we have these tools in front of us that we can use all day long. But tools aren't really designed with laziness in mind, or incompleteness, I should say, not even laziness, that I thought can only get started, that Zyger effect or something, where you start a thought, but you leave the project unfinished. So you can go back to it. I'd like to see AI tools work in that space so much more than in finished products. Anyway.
By the way, as I'm sitting here,
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I just really briefly, I'm using continuity with a cursor. It's insane. I had a Radius rocket in my Macintosh way back when, so I had a Mac in a Mac. But here I am with you guys, and I just move my cursor to the side of the screen, and I can click, render next or whatever it is, and then move the cursor back. It's magic. This is why Apple's going to win the VR race. It's like 80% of it, too. Just my perspective. Anyway, sorry, Brandel, please continue. It's just so bizarre.
Oh no, it's amazing. Continuity is such an incredible feature for also devices like headphones and other things. Being able to, it's the ability to arbitrarily use multiple Apple devices as though it's one continuous kind of computing surface.
Yeah.
So that you can use the shared clipboard between your phone and your Mac and all sorts of bits and pieces. It's incredible. I mean, there's some gaps. I really resent the fact that I can't attach a Bluetooth mouse to my iPhone. And I wish that you could negotiate and broker those things. I can't attach my Xbox controller. I don't know if anybody saw the turret gun toilet that I made a while ago, but that was really fun to be able to produce. On the context of on the subject of sort of deliberative tools and the signals that we get about what it is that we're doing, people mistaking the Twitter's sort of their utterances on Twitter, confusing what seems to be like a casual kind of rejoinder to being something broadcast to millions out on a megaphone. I feel like that's one of those places where the kind of details of implementation in a previous era told you a little bit about what it was that you were producing, simply because the sort of the administrative burden of producing so many million copies of your tweet would have necessitated being able to send it to the printers and make sure that they all did that properly so that it would be able to fit in the type machine and get it run off on all of the offset plate rolls and ensure that the logistics for all of the delivery boys would be ready to be able to send your tweets out to every street corner. Like the false symmetry that emerges in a system where everybody is on the same Twitter, but we're all not doing the same thing in terms of the public information, for better or worse, that flows out of it is problematic, and having more. I've also called it like leaky abstractions, like the way in which the reality of what it is that we're actually doing on a system has the ability to show through. Would be an interesting goal to pursue, or at least lens to consider. And like continuity is amazing. Also, Apple Silicon is amazing. so that it means that your computer never heats up anymore, but it means that we've lost that side channel of information about how onerous a particular set of computing tasks happens to be, such that most people will never hear their fan again, basically, unless they're really ruining something. And yeah, like I feel like those two concepts are related in terms of the sort of monomaniacal sort of fixation on abstraction and removal of detail is certainly a thing that you can do with computing and with the sort of task and concepts of information processing. But there are ways in which we've used those channels of information to be sort of independently meaningful in the past, and I'd love for us to discover
That's really
other
interesting.
ways in which to relate to stuff.
Yeah, that triggered something semantic that reminded me of how information theory is often misused, misapplied. Has more to do with the semantic ambiguity of the word information, right? It means like meaningful information to some people, and that's of course not what it was intended to mean at the time. And so I was thinking about that in context of feedback loops, right? Like you can't say that Twitter has a bad feedback loop. It's an incredible feedback loop, right? You say something and you either get responses or you get a vacuum. But in another way, there is the horrible feedback loop to what you're talking about, the asymmetry, right? Like you have no feedback to the potential risk. It's similar to the argument of COVID, right? Versus, right? It's just like flu. Why are we treating it so special? Well, because it has the potential to be way, way, way worse. And there are these other unknowns. So we have to treat it differently. I don't know of a word. I want a word for feedback that means that. And I imagine there probably is, but that would apply to Twitter because that would be very useful. Great point. Great point.
Can you help me understand that more?
I think it needs view specs.
Okay.
Wait, sorry, two things at once.
Yeah, Brandel was saying he thinks it means view spec, and I would like to hear more. And I love the leaky abstractions. I see Mark has written it here too. But
View spec.
yeah, Brandel, you want to say it again?
Sure. So I haven't read it yet, but I will. Mark linked a page about view specs from the Doug Engelbart Institute, and Engelbart used this term to mean having, well, as I understood prior to this, and maybe this will clarify and sharpen my perspective, but that when you have the ability to form custom views over the same intrinsic sort of data set, then you're using view specs. And so in an application like Illustrator, being able to do Command or Control Y to go to outline view is one example. Having the ability to sort of dynamically hide or focus, also to be able to zoom in. There, at least in the past, was and probably still is the ability to have multiple panels open on an Illustrator document to be able to kind of see different parts of it at different scales and things like that. Those are very clearly view specs because it's definitely the same document. 3D applications have to live and breathe on concept of view specs because there's no meaningful way in which one can understand all of the contents of a 3D file or document without having the ability to kind of look at it in different slices and conceptions. But nevertheless, understanding it to still be underlying the same data. And so, yeah, like the sense that the fact that Twitter is very mean about which views are actually presented these days has a massive implication for how people understand it. If you could see graphs of, or even approximate graphs of like what happens when somebody when somebody with 1.8 million viewers followers tweets versus somebody who has 18, you know, then we'd or even like where like it's actually, from at least outside the company, incredibly hard to come by how many viewers, how many followers X percentage of people has. So, you know, we have numbers of that are mostly from sort of 2013, 2014, and it's 10 years ago now. So we don't know how many people have how many followers unless we try to track it down and scrape. And that gives us a real dearth of context for being able to figure out what the hell a tweet does, or what kind of dynamics sort of apply and obtain as information flows through the system. I think that's for everybody's to everybody's detriment.
I have to take issue with the point there. I agreed with the first half of what you said, that in 3D you do need a view spec, but so does text. Can't have text without a view spec. The fact that it's a relatively, I know you know, but I think it's still a worthwhile point, because one of the things we're suffering now in academia specifically is not only the terror of PDF, it's also the terror of the specific weird layouts, which add all kinds of history, but it doesn't add any real metadata, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I remember a long time ago trying to explain to my parents 3D stuff, and I talk about wireframes, like, hang on, that's a render too. Similar with basic text. Mr. Allen.
Oh, yeah, I would, excellent, love that. I would, different than a view spec, or perhaps expanding the definition of view spec, what I would imagine would be the nuclear option for the kind of thing I'm talking about would be a like digital twin of yourself, where, you know, you send a tweet and you see a simulation play out in, you know, double, triple time of all the things that could happen, right? And then even the time scale horizon, not just what happens in 5 minutes, but oh, this leads to you your job in 2 weeks, right? I mean, and that's a hyperbolic example, but maybe it opens the doors to, like, instead of just a different view of the same data playing out, something more like a view spec of a cone of possibility, right? Sending this will likely land with this audience, you know, be kind of off-putting for here. You'll probably lose about 30 followers, you know, but gain 40. I mean, it's sort of the same thing, but I think the point is the cascading effects. And of course, even a simulation, even a digital twin simulation, you would just have to trust that it was running the right way and had all the parameters, which is asking way too much of those things. But I guess what I'm stressing there is a view of time and ramification and cause and effect, as opposed to different views of the data or the text.
Yeah, I just have two things to say to that. Number one, we need the metadata to make it possible. Number two, sitting in Europe, I'm not really comfortable with the phrase nuclear option at the moment, considering the madman not so far away and threats. That was just,
wow.
I'm trying to be semi-jokey. Of course, I have no problem with your language. It's just a weird, scary time we live in.
It's been so weird. Things are escalating too quickly. You can't even keep track of what's going on.
Yeah, it's messed up. I'm looking at Mark's thing here.
I'll just explain. Now that I've found the description of what the view spec was in NLS, I begin to understand. And I think that the other bit that's sort of swimming into focus is, of course, now I know I'm sitting in front of 3 screens with multiple windows, tabs, and all sorts of other things. If I was sitting in front of NLS, I'd be sitting in front of one sort of white and black screen. And so literally by typing codes, it would change. And dynamically so. So I wouldn't be flopping from one tab, fully formed thing to another. So in that sense, and you know, due to the equipment at the time, they were sitting much closer to the metal, so to speak. But I'm conscious that it doesn't help us to over obsess too much on the fine meaning what it was. I think the really interesting part is to get more people thinking about having multiple visualizations of the same underlying information. Because when I pause to think about it, how many people actually do that on a regular basis or do it deliberately? They will be exposed to it a lot, but I wonder how many people sort of deliberately in their own sort of work or browsing or whatever actually do that.
I think it was super important, Alan, what you said, maybe even a highlight of the day, when you waffled through all kinds of stuff. And I mean that as a compliment because you weren't being hard-nosed about it. In terms of use specs, being able to see this and that. And there are many things that aren't really in view specs in knowledge. My professor from Syracuse, he kept bugging me about GPS, saying it's such a knowledge thing, blah, blah, blah. It's like, for crying out loud, geography is not knowledge outside of navigation and geology, so to speak. It's not. But then, first of all, I realized time is something that is related to a lot of knowledge. A lot of knowledge, certain things happen at specific times. So we do have some coordinates to hold on to. And if you look at the kind of data you can get from a GoPro or whatever, it can show you where you were driving when you were filming and the speed and all kinds of stuff. I completely agree with you that to try to capture different aspects of the work we do and the communications we do, and even, we talked a million times about meeting capture, and of course that's an actual market. But what if my voice is suddenly a little aggressive? That should be a very, very different capture from everything else. These are really important things, but metadata is, maybe it's the word. Maybe we need another word, because when I was struggling with my PhD, one of the things they said in the Bible was, you've written this stuff in the document. Is it still metadata? And then you watch an FBI movie. We only have the metadata about their phone calls. Maybe we should invent another word, like, we need to capture the aspects of the things, what we do in it. Sorry, that's British. It's a really important thing. If you want to talk some more on this, Alan, that would be really good, but also an interjection. How are you doing? And how is the whole work situation?
Well, thank you for asking. And I mean, I'm doing fine. I appreciate it. I hope you're doing well too. It sounds like, I can't imagine all the stresses that you have been through, even just in the last, going back 3 months. I can't fathom that. So by comparison, I think I'm doing fine. Job situation is, I'm still on sabbatical and it's wonderful. I haven't pounded the pavement yet, but that's okay because I'm getting 4 years out of my system after through reading The Creative Habit, realizing that the job didn't match my creative DNA or whatever it's called, my imprint in the least. And so I want to make sure I don't make that
That's
mistake again.
the reason I was reminded to ask, Alan, because what you just talked about there seemed to be very different from what you were doing at work. And it just like, oh, work, yeah, that thing. And hence the question.
Yeah. And the larger scale of things, it'll be interesting to see whether it was a mistake or not. But I will say that on the different or a more nuanced variety of metadata as a term, I think could be useful because it is, the last thing we want is more terms, but it is really overextended, tremendously so. I mean, there's more metadata than there is data, as like a definition, right? Like almost like every entity you have is going to have at least the same amount of relation, unless it's total orphan, or it's going to have more relations than the entity, right? So I think of metadata as being relations around an entity, right?
Potentially, but not
just
necessarily.
It's a basic, it's a pure all point, but there's all kinds of metadata, and I think it could be easily more nuanced, in the same way of just quantitative versus qualitative metadata. There are probably some pretty low-hanging fruits of distinctions that could be made.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so a personal thing. I see your hand. Actually, yeah, mine's going to take a minute. Please go ahead, Mike.
Well, just a quick thing. I listening to others speak is that, you know, one of the things I noticed, I was asked to review some projects at the university, and amazingly, all of them aspired to basically, well, monetize by any other name their metadata. Not a single one basically explain what it was, other than clearly they expected enough exhaust to come off the process that they would sort of, you know, scrape off the wall and put in a box and so, you know, it's just this expectation, but gather enough crap, magic will happen. There was, so one aspect, one clarification that is worthwhile sort of drawing is data that you genuinely expected, you wanted and you expected to make, as opposed to essentially accidental things. And that doesn't mean that because it's accidental, it doesn't mean it doesn't have a worth. I don't mean a material worth in this sense, but it is not valuable to have. But simply that I think there is some description. There are things that you recorded because you thought you might want to know them later, as opposed to things that happened by happy accident because they were contingent on what you were doing. And that may be one area where some distinction can be placed.
So, just as a kind of a personal aside here, obviously my mother was unhappy on Friday with what happened. She came over in the evening, and as you know, we have a lot of people staying with us. The young boy plays with Edgar very well, and it's absolutely amazing. And you know, I let them run riot, as does Emily. So my mother was sitting watching them do a play, which was basically them fighting and shouting, and she didn't quite get it. And later on, we had a conversation. She said, how do I feel? Because she does understand that my job is not necessarily to encourage Edgar, but it's to make sure he doesn't feel embarrassed about trying things. Like right now, he's supposed to learn a song for school, and he will sing a bit and giggle. And I'll say, no, just sing. That's my job. You know, it's no rocket science here. But my father, my mother, and my community, when I was growing up in Norway, you know, you don't really do that kind of stuff. You know, there was a lot of conformity in the DNA. So my mother was a little bit concerned that my father had kind of stunted me. But the reason I'm bringing it up to my good friends here now, it's quite the opposite. My father had this ability of, well, Doug Engelbart said that your ability to mature is proportional to your ability to accept humiliation. You know, that's one of his sentences. And my father, I remember him sitting in a meeting with, you know, all these MBAs, and they're selling him this, that, and telling him this, that. And he would say, what do you mean by that acronym? You know, what is that? You know, he had no shame in asking basic questions. He had absolutely no tolerance for bullshit, which is why he managed to make a successful business. He didn't just coast on other people's advice. And I feel that that is what I've inherited from him in terms of what I feel is something to aspire to. And that's why I focus on PhD with this simple thing, which the chance of me getting, let's be honest, is almost zero. Because my PhD is simple, right at the back of the document what it is. You know, that doesn't fit in the academic thing. So don't worry, this is not a rant on that. But the point is, when we're looking at these different things, it really takes different aspects, like Alan's going all over the map thing. That's not an engineering thing, but it's a really important thing. But also, we as a community, at some point, we need to get organized. And by all I mean is to have a little bit more structure to what we're discussing when, and then to figure out the infrastructure, because metadata is part of the infrastructure. Right? And almost everything that we see that's going to be in VR cannot happen without serious data or metadata. You know, I'm trying not to use the term. And I'm really worried that Daryl Apple and others, well, even though they talk about the web, they will own a lot of this stuff. But if we're going to capture all these things that we do and then have it available in the future, it has to be captured in a way that is open and accessible, right? Really kind of dry stuff. But I think that if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we have to do the high and mighty flying blue sky stuff. And we have to do the, where's the rubber hit the ground? You know, it's like, The reason I've been asking, my father went to his grave not knowing what the word interface meant. Literally, you know, I tried to explain, you hold a knife and it's this aspect and that. No, it just wasn't real enough for him, right? We have to have that to an extent, I think. You know, okay, so you can see this in multiple dimensions. What does that mean? You know, why is it that color? Why can't these things hit together? I don't need this, I need that. Anyway, it's just been a weird weekend.
Yeah, I in preparation for the sort of the day's deliberations being on link types and metadata, I wrote a few pages.
You
what do I think
actually
about links, and
followed
what do I
our
think about-
structure. What is wrong with you?
It's been a while, you know. So
Thank you. Listening
so
intently.
I wrote about what do I think about links, what do I think about link types, what do I think about data, and then what do I think about metadata. And sort of similar to Alan, most of the things that I thought about those things were deeply non-pragmatic, you know, and very in pretty stark contrast to what I think, in the sense of what I think about it in the context of actually trying to build a prototype. And on the subject of links and link types, you know, one of the things that comes up to me time and time again is the conflict and tension between the reality of everything that happened in the past happened with 100% certainty in this order, or to whatever extent you can trust people's account of history, but everything that happens in the future is understood to be sort of probability distribution of like, that's one of the most valuable ways of thinking about it. It's like there's a certain percent chance this will happen, there's a certain percent chance that will happen. Links are interesting in that when you watch a movie, everybody watches the same movie, or everybody has at some level the same stimulus in the same order. When you create a hypertext, people don't have the same guarantees, and so links are a constant opportunity for derailment that nevertheless many people consider to be valuable for the benefit of being able to get what they get out of it, but it sort of separates us off probabilistically from each other in these buckets and bins of where we go. And I think that the concept of categorizing and clarifying link types only serves to exacerbate that, based on what kinds of opinions people might have about their purpose and their goals, as well as some aspects of their capability. All links have types in some sense, but categorizing them and having that data sort of renders the linkability of certain things, or for certain purposes, a little bit more thinkable. And I applaud that. And I think that, as you kind of talked about, with Dead Cell Publishing being an absolute dog's breakfast in the 80s and then settling down, that we have this profusion of opportunities and possibilities, many of which are stupid at the outset of a new medium, and at the interface between two media in particular, that is going to be is going to be a defining characteristic of things as people start to accommodate virtual reality, particularly within the context of a web and textual information and things like that. So that's about links and link type. And I can go on about data, but I'll let Mark jump in.
My thought was just prompted by something that Rana was saying, and I came back across is because I was having a discussion with Dini about, well, what is hypertext? Because I was having to lecture a course. And she said, well, I think of it as a platform. And I said, well, I think it's an environment. And it took me back some papers. I put something in the sidebar because 2004 and the ACM paywall starts at 2001. Everything before that's free now. Everything after is behind a paywall if you don't have access. And it's making it's a Waldrop Fruin right in 2004, but making this point that actually the arts and the sciences came to a slightly different view. Certainly the people who are doing hypertext literature, the link, it was all about stepping out of the linear form, and to the more scientific / technical side, it was about building things that were not linear and the rest, and they got excited about things like link taps because they wanted, it was AI version 2 I think at the time, and wanted to do basically they wanted to reason across a network. So hypertext was smushing up against AI at the time, perhaps not usefully so for the medium. But there was also something else you were saying about, you know, our view that things happen in an order. What's been fascinating, having had my head sort of dragged into hypertext history, sort of by accident, but not exactly resistingly, over recent weeks, is just how many things that when I sort of burrowed down into them absolutely didn't happen in a formed way. It's been really interesting talking to people who sort of were there at the time saying, no, it was just an idea, it was floating around. And there was, as Mark Bensley described, a sort of Precambrian explosion in about late 70s, early 80s of hypertext that then was eclipsed by the web. But yeah, that's, so there is something here about, you know, what we mean by it. And a great sadness, fun enough, for the community is for hypertext as a medium or an idea is that the input of the artistic side, which wasn't trying to go inside the lines, got Klaus in 2019 sort of brought some of the artists back because it's actually really useful, and it made me think, I don't know where the connection came, but I have to be revisiting Alan Kay's talk on normality, normality considered harmful. The main thrust of that was, you know, don't think too close, think further ahead. So, you know, the only reason we got stuff done at Park is we aimed so far ahead, we had to build the whole damn thing. Or you know, or rather, to investigate the problem, we had to build stuff. And in the process, we found that, lo and behold, we actually built stuff, which I thought was an interesting sort of observation. So, you know, oftentimes now, maybe we are aiming too close in with good intent, but what it means is that it tends to imprison us too closely in terms of what is possible now. And so it's, you know, for instance, it's interesting, the concept of what Fraserby do with author, which you dependent on how much you know about it, you could view on two levels. You could say, oh, it's another different writing tool. Those of us who know there's a bit more behind it than that might care to think differently. Though I would agree that you could, you know, depending on what you know, view it from two angles. Fred.
Oh, no, just keep talking about author. That's great. I was going to address the term link a little bit, because first of all, you kind of lead into it, Mark. I think I mentioned Vint Cerf and his notion of binding. Like, first time I met him was at restaurants, and he said, we're now bound by this restaurant. It is a thing, conceptual point that connects us. So metadata about this metadata at this restaurant should connect us. That's one thing. And that is, of course, what we looked at earlier in the map of author. Part of the point is you put things maybe a little bit closer if you think the link is stronger. You don't have to write it out as a link type. You know, so the spatial relationship has meaning for you. It can be computed. It isn't an author, but it can be. But then also, if we go into the Doug language, the thing that I think is so very, very, very important is addressability, because he talked about views and jumping. That was his thing. He didn't really care about links very much. You know, that was just one way you go from A to B. There are so many other things that were interesting to him, such as action or criteria links. For instance, what he could do is have a link to go into his document called address book and go to the section of somebody named Watson, whatever, and copy back if there's a phone number. So that kind of full grammatical, as I called it to him, command is very useful. Is that a link? No, it's generated on the fly and it's a command. You know, I think you're absolutely right, Mark, when you're talking that links are a bit over romanticized, over fetishized, I would say. You know, it's only one small way to move around knowledge. You know, I built the Liquid tool as a way to copy Doug's NLS because it's NLS upside down. You know, it's a way you can, you know, move around things. So Brandel, thank you for keeping us on track today. And Mark, thank you for reminding us that a lot of, you know, the people in history are just people. We kind of need to go beyond that now, right? you know, oh, Randall, you're muted. I can see you're trying to
I
communicate.
was muted.
You
Yeah.
are.
So I've talked about it before, but there's a continuum of linkness, right? In terms of, well, there's a continuum of relatedness in terms of whether somebody might choose to actually cite and dynamic or and at this point, unfortunately, statically transclude something by quoting directly within the corpus of a text. Then there's having a link, like being able to have, say, an iframe or some representation that maintains the distinction between this and that, but nevertheless shows you a view of it. And then there's putting a hyperlink to something that's extant elsewhere, and then there's simply naming it explicitly. And those are all, like, particularly because of the way that, for example, I use the internet and the way that browsers permit people, although it would be fascinating to find out how much people really do. If you select and right click your text selection, then most browsers have the ability to either look up or search with Google or both. Again, like, given how few people, 90% of people do not know about find on page on a desktop browser, my expectation is that the use of that would be pretty slim, but nevertheless, pretty important. So there's this continuum of linkness, and it's interesting to hear that Engelbart was not particularly excited by the concept of links, although I would hope that he would concede that the relatedness of two pieces of text, two pieces of information, necessitate the linkness of them and the linkability, the jumpability. Like if he thought of things in terms of jumps, then the possibility and the plausibility of a specific jump being capable of being actioned must itself be understood as a link in some sense.
Yeah, he would say that a word's entry in the dictionary is an implicit link. That was really important for him. Explicit links and implicit links.
Yeah, it's something that weighs on my mind heavily, because one of the things that Heather and I play now every day pretty obsessively is a game called Semantle. If you haven't played it, it's phenomenal. It's making use of the Word2Vec data set, which is this very large multidimensional data set of all of the English words. And so it computes the semantic distance from whatever word you happen to have chosen and the target word. And if you get into the top 1,000, then they're enumerated in order based on some reduction of it. And it's great because you have the ability to see.
Oh. Echo.
What's going on?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. It's really interesting because of the way in which, like, that continuum can be understood. To have these words sort of peripherally related and these words increasingly related, and it's interesting because a lot in terms of the relatedness between different sort of terms and concepts.
Fro, that may be on your end, perhaps.
Yes.
I don't think Fro's with us anymore.
Working on it.
Could be. Well, this is probably a good time then to end it out, but assuming if it does get fixed, this is a great book. And it applies to what we were talking about, and specifically in the links. There's a line in here. Okay, it seems to be all right. There's a line in here that although computer operating systems need hierarchical file systems, the people who use them don't. It's not surprising that computer programmers like to see the underlying hierarchical file systems, but it's equally unremarkable that normal users like Jane don't. I've been thinking about, I don't totally agree about the continuum of links, and I even think that tags are a form of links. and so even that could be enhanced. And sometimes even just simple experiments like if a tag is a product of that hierarchical thinking. So members are either you're either in the in group of a tag or in the out group. If instead a tag held a table of weights and the members of the tag plus the weights of proximity to that tag, you could get maybe something a little more like Semantle, but that you could combine yourself, right? It could even be a spatial distance confers how close this idea is to the set of the tag. And even if you go over a certain threshold, you could maybe indicate this is the opposite of that tag. I don't know what to call it, but it is everything that this tag is not, there could be so much done there. And I like I only use weights because that's the only term I have handy, but it is good to get away from the hierarchical thinking that is foisted on us by programmers, especially in these knowledge problems, and being able to use whatever tools. Weights is the only one that I have handy at the moment, but whatever tools to imply either emotion or distance or intent, vague, seemingly appallingly vague things to a programmer to code in. But that's where I think the swamplands are, the undiscovered country of contextual relations rests. Broder, you back?
I'm back. This Semantle game, I managed to get how do you start playing it, Randall? What do you do?
You enter words, and then it gives you a score, and so it says if you write in like person, woman, man, camera, TV, then you'll see.
I just typed in chocolate. Yeah, sorry, Alan. I was conversation behind there.
That's all right.
So yeah, through the semantic similarity, person is by far the most similar word, and so it might be today's thing might actually be a person's occupation or a person, like a description of a person or something like that. And so yeah, you can kind of sort of hone your domain, and so you look for synonyms or antonyms, and you look for different shades of meaning as you're sort of seeking through it to land on it. But it's also fun because you get more than 5 guesses. What I wanted to say about so I think that one of the problems with the programming as well has been just the parsimony with which people have believed they need to operate in computing. And I think that now that we have, hopefully a large number of frankly more naive people in the form of things like web developers, in comparison to lower level systems programmers who sort of count the number of bytes that they're wasting on their fingers and fret about every one. People with solely JavaScript experience, I feel fortunately have no such compunction. I look forward. I always think that wasting stuff is great in terms of the imagination of what we might be able to do when certain sort of components and dimensions of the cost structures become too cheap to matter. And so data storage is one of those things. MongoDB and the NoSQL sort of a structureless approach to data storage is an important component of that. But I think that we have a lot more to go in terms of imagining that we might record, like I said, like all of the pressure of all of the keystrokes or multiple camera angles of somebody as they're typing a document. All of these things are phenomenally wasteful, but I think necessary for us to be able to take a next step in imagining what we might be able to do to relate text and understand what it is, and to be able to have a better basis on which to reason about why somebody wrote something or what we might be able to get out of it.
There is a book by I forget the author's name, but The Mind is Flat. where he makes the argument through so many, Nick Chater, he makes so many examples of this, how we justify things kind of after the facts. You know, why did you think that? Because of this, but clearly you didn't know. So I think we're talking in many different ways of how to make a structure, you know, a mental structure where we can use the technology. You know, right now we're talking about this bit here, but then, you know, once we talking about this may fade or go away. You know, you look at our tiny little brains are. I think that relates a lot to addressability. It relates a huge amount to linking, metadata, capture. But, you know, the question is, what kind of things you would capture? Should it be the mechanical things or the cognitive things? Or are they in many cases the same thing? I think will be a very useful area to pursue. And Fabian has been very quiet today, most of the day. You know, he's obviously building things where a lot of this can actually happen. That's very good. Now, Fabian, at the beginning of the discussion today, you talked about your treadmill. What is the particular reason? Is it general health or something else?
Yeah, just general health, and I think I tend to think better when I'm in movement, ideally through the woods or the park next door, but that can make it tricky. So yeah, and it's I managed to do it with the headset on. As you actually might have noticed, at some point I was testing something and I managed not to crash my face on the camera, so that was a win. But yeah, I wanted at some point to connect it actually with a headset. So I have some cameras that I wanted to move through the treadmill, but it's a linear one, you just go forward. But yeah. Experimentation and health. Let's say everything I do has a little bit of experimentation in it, I think, I hope.
Yeah, you know,
It's funny you say that, because yeah, I mean, I was thinking, I mean, now I reflect, I stand up when I take phone calls and I tend to walk around, and it's a form of stimming. It bleeds off energy. So I'm not sort of, it keeps me concentrating. You know, it bleeds off the excess energy that I otherwise use looking out the window or getting distracted or reading an email in the middle of the call. But I was prompted to stick my paw up because I can't remember exactly what it was Randall said, but it was something he was saying at the time. I got sent an interesting, something that's proved to be more interesting than I thought. I was helping somebody with something, and he sent me a file that is his work. He does sort of close reading and annotation, which is a thing my mind just doesn't get on with. But he's a Russian guy. He's writing in English, but using English, Cyrillic, and Tibetan, because he's writing, I think, about Tibetan texts. But the funny thing was that it was this thing of thinking, actually, this is really fun. I can now do all the things I'm used to doing without understanding anything about the text, because I can't read Cyrillic, I can't read Tibetan, and started doing things that I'm used to doing, to seeing if they were actually giving me any traction. Because as a nice little sort of meta reflection, no pun intended, on some of the mechanisms I'm used to using with analyzing text that I do without thinking, but in the moment normally thinking that I'm understanding what's going on, or am I? You know, so and it's almost it allows me to almost experience the text like a computer, because it's just a number of symbols whose meaning I don't understand. And I'm entirely dependent on the prompts that I get given. Anyway, I leave that observation for what it's worth. But I found it unexpectedly rather exciting.
Interesting. Yeah, we need to wrap up. But just on the whole walking thing, the Wolfram Alpha guy, he did some experiments where he was on his laptop working on the treadmill, and he found that actually walking outside was much more beneficial for him, which of course, Fabian, you just said. But you all know this thing about the psychological effect of motion, right? It's to the point where some psychiatrists are using it in the office. They get people to do specific eye movements while they're sitting down, because when we walk forward, our brain feels more relaxed, because clearly there's no danger in front of us, so we're in control. So it quietens down, I think, I don't know which part of the brain, but just absolutely hugely spectacular. And it's based on the eye movement, not the physical movement of the body or the head. So that these things are measurable.
That's actually why.
What's that?
Oh, an agency I worked with when I was in the enterprise were fans of saying that they were the ones that invented ping pong in engineering departments. For that reason, because they'd be typing away, everything would all be in one blaring screens, and their eyes would get tired. So they invented ping pong as a distraction, and also it would help with the quick ocular range of motion, which would help them feel more relaxed. I don't know if that's bullshit or not, but but it's certainly a fact that for a long time ping pong tables were in every dev studio, and I hated it.
Well, it is a bit loud, but that's really cool. Thank you. Fabian.
Just super briefly, but everything, as I mentioned before, I tend somehow to do experimentation with pretty much anything I can do. And one thing I did not try yet, and hopefully you'll see me back to talk about it, is as I get a little bit better roller skating every time, is of course doing roller skating with the headset on. I don't know if that will be stable enough, or if I'll be good enough for it not to crash. If I crash the headset, I don't care, as long as I don't hurt myself. But then I'll have to start to think how placing things in space at a much larger scale will do. So that's part of the experimentation, blending the two.
Wow.
I think that's really important. And please let me spend a second saying why. With all these technologies that can, with VR headset, you can sit in a corner all day. I think that they do open up much more physical involvement as well, and mental. I can imagine you putting sensors in your rollerblades. So when you're in a physical environment, it measures that. It can change what you see with all of this, and it can help you sport, fun, health, work, everything. Yeah, hugely important that it doesn't just become a sit-down thing. Amazing. Okay, very, very happy to be here in all senses of the of the word, and look forward
We'll be
to
praying for you to make a full recovery.
Oh no, I made a full recovery. That's the weird thing. But this small one, it lasted under half an hour. The sentences didn't come out right, even when I wrote them down, which was just horrifying in retrospect. But yeah, by the time I got to the hospital, I was completely fine. They just needed to check that I wasn't another one imminently. But now I have a 40% chance of having a second one. I just looked at the stats today. Never look at stats, people. Never look at stats.
Maybe it's an avenue to understand aphasia more. I know personally, I feel like markedly since COVID or something, it has become markedly noticeably different how difficult it is for me to type.
Well, I choose to look at it as you have a 60% chance of not having another one.
Yeah,
That's great.
Beware recommend assistance. People who had this also,
Peter, I'm glad you're not my lawyer. That's frightening what you're saying, Alan. Even with very good speech to text systems now, like I hardly ever type on this thing. I just say stuff. When we're intellectually writing, we do need to type. Yeah, that's not good.
It's a weird experience. Yeah, go ahead.
Please have a look at the Augmented Text website, and it's not about checking author or anything right now, but it's regarding what you just said. Just briefly.
I have it up.
Okay, and then just click through to be on the author page because it has a bit more text, right? How do you find reading on there, guys? I think this is a Squarespace theme. I think this typography is phenomenal. It helps me read, it helps me edit. Or do you think it's all the same by your vision?
If there's any, I love it, and you could leave it exactly how it is. It reminds me of Tufty CSS, which is really pretty much the same font, except that they've pushed the body of the text over because of the ideal number of characters you want per line. And that leaves space over to the right, like all of Tufty's books, to add annotation. And it's a beautiful model.
I was Tufty was the guy I mentioned earlier when I said take a picture of nature and I drop the colors to make a good graphic. Thank you for
Yeah.
it. Yeah. But for Brandel and Fabian, who consider yourself less designery, if I understand you, reading something here.
Oh no, I'm a designer. I just don't think visually.
But right, no. You're a designer
It's
like that.
definitely
In projection, yes, absolutely. I mean, just look at your shirts. You know, you are very much a designer. But in terms of reading, is it easier for you guys to read this page rather than, let's say, some text on CNN or ACM?
No difference to me.
You're very lucky, Fabian.
ACM is impossible to read, just about. So
Yeah, but I shape back the content also the way I want. So it's either I'm lucky it works, or otherwise I just edit it until it's how I can consume it.
You're talking about augmented text.info and the author and reader pages?
Yeah, specifically author was what Fred was asking about.
Yeah, I just.
I mean, I find it clear to read, partly because the text has more space to breathe, and I mean, but that's been a general progression, especially in the sort of blog type space, where because it reads the templates, but people are giving more space to the words using slightly larger fonts. That actually, certainly on a sort of desktop or laptop screen, I find makes it easier to read quite fast. Because if it's very, very dense, I find I have to concentrate a lot more. I get lost more easily.
yeah, and specifically the App Store reviews. If I were actually like, you know, nitpicking, yeah, the 2-column with the longer snippets on the left and then the App Store reviews on the right, they don't line up, and so I would actually de-emphasize or like make it into a bullet list, anything like that for the App Store reviews, just so that they're not competing visually, right?
I can have a play with that. Thank you. But the reason I'm asking, we talked about a lot of visual things today, is the morning of my stroke. Before it happened, I was doing some proofreading on my page. I found quite a few errors. And I was just noticing that I found it for once easy to read my own writing. And, you know, author as well has lots of space and all that stuff. It just seems to be such an obvious thing to do that typography really, really matters for readability. So I'm glad that even somebody who may not consider themselves type aficionados, half of us are, I think, roughly at least, also feels that there is a benefit. So I'll see what I can do about that column, by the way. It's not super easy. It's all a bit weird. And anyway, thank you all for today. That was layers and layers of wonderful things. Have a good week, and I look forward to Monday. Actually, before we go, do we have anything planned for Monday? Yes, David LeBeau is on Monday.
Is it next? Oh.
So that'll be good.
Oh, very good. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that'll be a very interesting aspect of this. All right. Yeah, if there's anything, obviously I'm here all week. Look forward to Monday. Bye, guys. Bye.